the orange glow of molten steel reflected in the sweat on Linda's forehead. But the heat wasn't what made her hands shake. High above the roaring machinery of the Gary plant, she gripped the vibrating railing of the catwalk, her eyes locked on her husband's phone as it lit up with a single, devastating notification. "The kids miss you. We're waiting at the usual place." They didn't have children, and the usual place certainly wasn't their home. Below her, the massive rollers groaned, ready to crush anything that fell into their path, mirroring the way her chest tightened as she watched Mark slip his phone away and glanced nervously toward the exit. A sudden, piercing alarm cut through the industrial din, signaling a catastrophic pressure leak. But Linda didn't move toward the safety stairs. She watched the man she had slept beside for 15 years disappear into the thick, sulfurous steam of the lower deck, heading toward a part of the city where even the police refused to patrol. As the factory walls trembled and sparks rained down like dying stars, Linda realized the life she was working double shifts to save had been a lie, long before the machines started to fail. She stepped off the platform and into the shadows, following the only man she trusted into a truth that felt more dangerous than the collapsing mill. The foreman's whistle shrieks through the din, sharp as a rusted nail dragged across metal. Linda doesn't flinch. She's learned to ignore the way it grates against her teeth, the way it makes her jaw clench until her molars ache. Instead, she wipes her palms on the thighs of her coveralls, the fabric stiff with old grease and the sweat of a dozen shifts before this one. The stitching along the knee is fraying, a loose thread catching on the edge of the conveyor belt as she steps closer. "You're late," the foreman says, not looking up from his clipboard. His voice is flat, the kind of tone that doesn't need to rise to cut through noise. A rivet gun sputters somewhere to the left, and the scent of burning oil curls into the air between them. Linda exhales through her nose. Bus broke down on 12th, had to walk the last mile. He finally lifts his head, eyes flicking over her like she's a misaligned bolt in the assembly line. Again. She doesn't answer. The truth is, the bus didn't break down. She missed it, standing too long outside the pawn shop on 5th, staring at the neon "We Buy Gold" sign until her reflection in the glass blurred. But the foreman doesn't need to know that. He doesn't need to know about the envelope in her pocket either, the one with her mother's name scrawled across it in shaky script, the one that's been burning a hole in her side since yesterday. A crane groans overhead, its cables straining as it hoists a fresh load of scrap metal. The sound vibrates through the soles of her boots, up her shins, settling in her bones like a warning. She rolls her shoulders, feels the pull of old scars beneath the fabric. The foreman's pen scratches against paper. Another write-up, another docked paycheck. But she's already turning away, her fingers curling into fists inside her gloves. The line won't wait. Neither will the bills. Linda McAllister presses her chin into the stiff collar of her heavy jacket as the massive iron gates of the Gary Steelworks groan open, swallowing her into the belly of the beast. The air inside possesses a distinct, violent flavor. Burnt scale and sulfur that leaves a coating of grit on the tongue. A metallic aftertaste that never truly washes away. High above, massive ladles brimming with molten orange slurry glide along overhead rails, radiating a dry, unbearable heat that makes the moisture in her eyes evaporate instantly. The cacophony of the forging presses hammers into her skull, rhythmic and relentless, drowning out every stray thought until only the pulse of the machinery remains. She navigates the production line with the practiced ease of a ghost in a haunted house, stepping over orange sparks that rain down from welding stations like a localized storm. Beneath the soles of her boots, the concrete floor vibrates with a tectonic tension, the shudder of gargantuan engines straining against their bolts. The shift hasn't even fully begun before the friction starts. Near the secondary conveyor, Jackson and Miller stand chest to chest, their faces flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. Their shouts are mere pantomime against the roar of the shop floor, but the intent is unmistakable. Jackson draws back a heavy, grease-stained fist, his knuckles white. Linda doesn't hesitate. She wedges herself between the two men, her palms slamming into their sweat-soaked coveralls with enough force to startle them. She doesn't waste breath screaming. Instead, she locks her eyes onto Jackson's cracked, dry lips, holding his gaze with a predatory stillness until his arm drops. A nearby steam pipe chooses that moment to hiss, a jet of white vapor screaming into the rafters. And the tension in the air begins to settle like the pervasive layer of soot covering every surface. With a sharp jerk of her chin, she points Miller back toward his station, her finger steady as she indicates a jammed component on the belt. She waits, arms crossed, until the rhythmic clatter of their tools resumes, proving the line still holds. The relative order of the floor offers no sanctuary once she enters the supervisor's office. The air here is stagnant, smelling of dregs from a coffee pot that hasn't been cleaned in years and the stale, clinging odor of cheap tobacco. Mr. Harris, the plant manager, refuses to look up from the mountain of paperwork on his desk. His hand, thick-fingered and trembling slightly, moves a red felt-tip marker down a list of names. Linda watches the nib pause, hovering with agonizing deliberation near her own name. Harris begins to speak, his voice a low drone about optimization, market fluctuations, and necessary workforce reductions. The words drop into the silence like heavy lead weights, sinking into the pit of her stomach. She squeezes her fists so tight, her nails carve crescents into her palms, her skin protesting the pressure. The walls of the office, plastered with faded production charts from better decades, seem to constrict, stealing the oxygen from the room. Linda offers a single, sharp nod, her eyes fixed on the jittery movement of Harris's hand, before she turns and leaves without a word. The weight of the shift follows her home, clinging to her clothes like the smell of the furnaces. When she turns the key in her front door, the familiar scents of fried onions and old, damp wood greet her. But they offer no comfort. Mark is slumped on the sofa, his face washed in the sickly blue glow of his smartphone. At the sound of the door, he jerks upright, his thumb flying across the screen as he shoves the device deep into the pocket of his jeans. He nearly upends a lukewarm mug of tea in his haste. Linda moves toward him, her arms reaching out for the simple anchor of an embrace, but he slips away with a practiced, fluid motion. He mutters something about the kettle and disappears into the kitchen. In the wake of his movement, she catches a faint, discordant note, a scent of perfume that doesn't belong to her, and the cold draft of his avoidance. She stands in the center of the living room, watching his silhouette against the kitchen tile, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Dinner is a grim affair. She sets down bowls of steaming stew, the ceramic clattering against the table, and tries to snag his wandering gaze. Mark merely probes at the meat with a fork, his attention riveted to the floral pattern of the tablecloth as if it contained a hidden code. When she tries to bridge the silence with talk of a vacation they can't afford or the leaking roof that needs a patch, his fork slips, clanging against the bowl with a sound as sharp as a gunshot. He rubs his temples, his voice a raspy mumble about a headache, about a long day at an office that seems to demand less work and more secrecy. Linda watches the pulse thrumming in his neck, a frantic, rhythmic beat. He stands abruptly, leaving his meal untouched, and the bedroom door clicks shut behind him. The sound of the ticking wall clock swells to fill the void, counting down the seconds of a life that is rapidly deconstructing. Hours later, the house is a tomb of shadows. Linda sits in the dark of the living room, listening to the heavy, rhythmic snoring that drifts from the bedroom. On the coffee table, Mark's forgotten phone glints under a sliver of moonlight. Her fingers tremble as she reaches for it, the plastic casing feeling unnaturally cold against her skin. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for exit, drowning out the soft patter of rain against the glass. She presses the home button. The screen ignites, flooding her face with a harsh, clinical white light that carves deep shadows into the corners of the room. She holds her breath, ears straining for any change in Mark's breathing, any rustle of the sheets that might signal his awakening. Her thumb hovers over the messaging icon, a small, glowing gate to a truth she isn't sure she can survive. The screen yields its secrets with a single swipe. She opens a message from a contact saved only as a period. "The kids miss you so much." The text reads, "They're waiting at the usual place." Linda reads the words once, twice, 3 times, her internal temperature plummeting. They never had children. The word kids strikes her with more physical force than a factory accident. She checks the timestamp. Sent an hour ago, while Mark was supposedly drifting into sleep. The screen times out, plunging her back into darkness. But the image of those words remains burned into her retinas. The phone in her hand feels like a live coal, searing through the calluses of her palms, turning the last 15 years of her marriage into a pile of gray ash. She slides off the chair and onto the cold kitchen tile, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud. A silent scream tears at her throat, but she chokes it back, her shoulders heaving with a violent, soundless tremor. She looks up at their wedding photo on the wall, Mark laughing, his arm looped around her waist. And the image feels like a cruel, calculated joke. The chill of the floor seeps through her leggings, but she doesn't move, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the deception. Her life in Gary, the struggles at the mill, the shared dreams of a quiet retirement. It all dissolves into slag. She bites her lip until the metallic taste of blood fills her mouth, a grim anchor to reality. As the first gray light of dawn begins to bleed through the curtains, the morning brings no resolution, only a sharper edge to the pain. From behind the heavy drapes of the dining room, she watches Mark creep down the stairs. He ignores his briefcase, opting instead for a worn windbreaker, his hands frantically checking his pockets for keys or cash. Through the glass, she sees him pause at the end of the driveway, casting a furtive, guilty glance back at the house before sliding into the car. The engine turns over with a muffled growl, and he rolls away without his headlights, a ghost disappearing into the morning fog. Linda grips the fabric of the curtain until her knuckles turn white. Once the taillights vanish, she stands in the absolute silence of the house, feeling a cold, calculating rage begin to boil beneath her skin, replacing the hollow ache of the night. At the plant, the world continues to tilt. She stands before the main control console, but the rows of glowing red digits blur into a single, meaningless smear. A piercing whistle from a safety valve snaps her back. Pressure is spiking in Sector 4, a critical overheat she nearly missed. Her hands jerk as she reaches for the override, but her fingers are clumsy, hitting the wrong toggles in a frantic scramble. The hum of the turbines, usually a comforting sign of productivity, now sounds like a mocking whisper, repeating the words from the phone over and over. She wipes sweat from her brow with an oily glove, leaving a dark, theatrical smear across her forehead. Her crew exchanges worried glances, watching their supervisors stare into the middle distance while the conveyor continues its indifferent, mechanical crawl. During her break, she retreats to the sanctuary of the women's locker room, bolting the door of a stall. She pulls a small notebook from her pocket and begins to write. She logs the time Mark left, the direction he took, the patterns of his absences. Her gaze is no longer frantic. It is hardened into the icy resolve of a woman who has spent her life controlling molten steel. She opens her banking app, eyes narrowing as she calculates the cost of fuel and the price of the truth. There are no more tears. She pulls the laces of her work boots so tight, the leather bites into her instep, grounding her. She decides then that she will not spend another night in the dark. The air at the gas station smells of high-octane fuel and wet pavement. Linda watches the numbers on the pump climb, the rhythmic clicking of the nozzle a countdown. She fills the tank to the brim, every gallon a gallon closer to the end of the lie. She returns home just long enough to see Mark's car pull back in, but she stays out of sight, a hunter in her own neighborhood. When the sun finally dips below the horizon, casting the industrial skyline into a silhouette of jagged teeth, she prepares. The 12-hour shift ends, and the factory gates disgorge a tide of exhausted souls. But Linda doesn't head for the comfort of her bed. She kills the engine of her old pickup half a block from her house, tucking the vehicle into the deep shadow of a sprawling maple tree. She douses the lights and waits, her fingers mindlessly picking at a loose thread on the steering wheel cover. Her heart beats a frantic rhythm against her ribs, loud enough to drown out the soft patter of rain on the roof. When the front door of her house finally opens, she ducks below the dashboard, her eyes level with the window frame. Mark emerges, moving with a frantic, twitchy energy. He carries a bulging duffel bag, the straps straining against his grip. Linda watches him heave the weight into the back seat of his car. The suspension groans under the sudden load. He doesn't just drive away. He flees, tires spitting gravel as he guns it toward the south side of Gary. Linda counts to 10, her breath hitching, before she pulls out behind him. She keeps her lights off as long as she dares, trailing the faint red glow of his taillights through the crumbling infrastructure of the city. The scenery degrades with every mile. The proud brick facades of the old Gary give way to the skeletal remains of warehouses and tenements with hollowed-out windows. A lone streetlight flickers overhead with a dying hum, casting a strobe-like jitter over the cracked pavement. The smell of the river, thick with rot and industrial runoff, drifts through the vents. Mark's car turns into a narrow alleyway choked with debris, and Linda kills her engine, letting the truck coast to a stop in the velvet blackness. She feels the silence of the slums pressing in on her, a heavy, suffocating weight. Mark pulls up in front of a dive called The Coleman. Above the door, a neon sign buzzes fitfully, the C and L dark so it just reads, The Oamen. 3 men step out from the gloom of the entryway, their leather jackets slick with the mist. Linda watches through the glass as Mark exits the car, clutching a thick manila envelope to his chest. One of the men, his face bisected by a jagged scar, steps into the light. Mark hands over the envelope. The man's fingers move with a predatory efficiency, riffling through a stack of cash that represents months of Linda's overtime. She watches Mark's knees tremble, his body language that of a man pleading for his life. She slips out of the truck, the door latch clicking with agonizing loudness in the quiet alley. She crouches behind a rusted dumpster, the smell of sour refuse and old metal filling her lungs. Through a gap in the bins, she sees the man with the scar nod toward a heavy iron door at the back of the bar. Mark follows them inside, the yellow spill of light from the interior vanishing as the door clangs shut with a finality that makes Linda's stomach churn. The next morning, the sky over the plant is the color of a bruised lung. When Linda pulls up to the gates, the usual hum of the morning shift is gone, replaced by a low-frequency roar. Hundreds of workers in grease-stained grays have formed a jagged line across the entrance. Jackson is there, standing atop an oil drum, his voice cracking as he leads a chant that nobody seems to believe in. Someone has set a pile of tires on fire near the perimeter fence, the black, oily smoke spiraling into the gray sky. Linda tries to push through the crowd, but the desperation is physical, a wall of heat and shouting. The word closure ripples through the mass like a contagion. Inside the administration building, the air is unnervingly still. Mr. Harris's desk is a barren wasteland of cleared calendars and empty pen holders. He doesn't look at her when she enters. He simply slides a single sheet of paper across the wood. The official seal at the top looks like a tombstone. Linda reads the words, "Immediate termination of contract," and feels the moisture leave her mouth. Harris mumbles something about unavoidable circumstances, but his voice is distant, like he's speaking from the bottom of a well. 15 years of her life, the heat of the furnaces, the scars on her hands, all reduced to a standard issue paragraph. She drives straight to the bank, her mind a chaotic whirl of Mark's secret meetings and the pink slip in her pocket. The teller avoids her eyes, tapping at a keyboard with agonizing slowness. When the printer spits out her balance, Linda's vision narrows to a pinprick. The college fund, the emergency savings, the get-out-of-Gary money, it's gone. A string of massive cash withdrawals, all signed by Mark over the last week, has bled the account dry. She stands in the sterile, air-conditioned lobby, the hum of the vents sounding like a long, sustained scream. She returns home to find a final insult. A bright red envelope tucked into the doorframe. Final notice. The utility company is cutting the power in 24 hours. She looks at her house, the place she's scrubbed and painted and tried to turn into a fortress, and realizes it's just a shell. She thinks of the bills Mark said he'd paid, the lies he'd told over coffee, and the rage finally finds its shape. It isn't a hot, explosive thing. It's cold, heavy, and sharp. She marches into the garage, the smell of sawdust and motor oil grounding her. She kicks Mark's heavy oak workbench aside, the wood screeching against the concrete. Beneath it, a loose floorboard yields to her prying fingers. She pulls out a cigar box, its cedar scent masked by the smell of damp earth. Inside, she finds the true map of their ruin. A stack of IOUs, the handwriting hurried and desperate. The names of the creditors are names she recognizes from the police blotter, men who don't take payments in installments. The numbers are astronomical, a debt that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off on a supervisor's salary. Linda sinks to the floor, the kitchen tiles hard against her spine. The house is silent, but it's the silence of a sinking ship. She looks at the ceiling, at the hairline crack that seems to have grown since yesterday, and realizes the man she shares a bed with is a stranger who has traded their future for something she can't even name. She doesn't cry. She can't afford the weakness. Instead, she stands up, her movements deliberate and slow. She goes back to the garage and picks up a heavy 16-inch steel pipe wrench. She feels its weight, the cold, uncompromising bite of the metal against her palm. She drops it into her bag. The clank of the tool against the bottom is the only sound in the room. She knows where he'll be. He'll go back to the plant one last time, to the shadows of the decommissioned sectors where the cameras don't work and the guards don't patrol. She walks out into the night, the wrench a heavy secret at her side, her eyes fixed on the distant, flickering lights of the mill. The chain-link fence at the perimeter is a jagged mess of rusted wire and broken dreams. Linda slides through a gap where the mesh has been peeled back, the cold steel snagging her jacket with a sound like a sharp intake of breath. She doesn't care. Her fingers are locked around the handle of the wrench in her bag, the metal leaching the warmth from her hand. She moves through the graveyard of the outer yard, dodging the piles of slag and the rusted skeletons of abandoned machinery. The wind howls through the empty corrugated sheds, a long, mournful note that harmonizes with the distant, dying hum of the city. She sees a flicker of light, a weak, uncertain beam dancing across the soot-stained walls of the rolling mill. Mark is there, silhouetted against the massive, silent cylinders of the primary press. He's pacing, his boots crunching on a carpet of metal shavings and dried grease. He keeps pulling his hood low, glancing into the dark maws of the side aisles as if expecting the shadows to grow teeth. Linda watches him from behind a concrete pillar, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts that bloom into white mist in the freezing air. She hears the rhythmic clack-clack of his boots, a frantic, uneven sound that betrays his terror. She steps into the light, the wrench already in her hand. Mark jumps, a strangled yelp escaping his throat as he stumbles back against a massive oil tank. He looks at her, then at the heavy steel tool in her grip, and for a moment, the only sound is the frantic, mechanical wheeze of a failing compressor somewhere in the rafters. The light from his dropped flashlight rolls across the floor, illuminating the grease stains on his jeans and the sheer, pathetic desperation in his eyes. "Linda," he gasps, his voice cracking. "I can explain." "Explain the money, Mark," she says, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Explain the kids." The compressor above them chooses that moment to die. The sudden absence of sound is deafening, leaving a vacuum that seems to pull the air from her lungs. The great machines of the Gary Works stand like silent, indifferent gods. Their era over. Linda feels the vibration in the floor cease, a stillness so profound it makes her ears ring. The smell of cooling iron and stagnant water rises around them, the scent of an ending. Mark reaches into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements slow and shaky, as if he's afraid she'll strike him before he can finish. He pulls out a photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. Linda takes it, her eyes never leaving his face until the paper is in her hand. It's a picture of two young boys, their faces smudged with dirt, grinning in front of a sagging porch in a neighborhood that makes their own look like a palace. "My brother's boys," Mark whispers, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Jason, he didn't just die, Linda. He left a hole. Emily, she's been sick. No work, no food. I couldn't let them starve. I couldn't tell you because I knew we didn't have enough for ourselves, let alone them. I thought I could win it back. The track, the games. I just wanted to be the man who could take care of everyone." He sinks to the floor, his back sliding down the cold metal of the tank. He hides his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent, racking shame. Linda looks at the photo, then at the broken man at her feet. The monster of her imagination, the cheating husband, the cold-hearted gambler, dissolves, replaced by something much more tragic. A man crushed by a duty he wasn't strong enough to carry. The rage in her chest doesn't vanish, but it shifts, turning into a heavy, leaden weight of shared failure. She takes a step toward him, the groaning of the overhead walkway echoing through the empty hall. She realizes now that the secrecy wasn't about a lack of love, but a surplus of pride. The same pride that kept her from crying on the shop floor, the same pride that was currently burying the city of Gary. She sees him not as a betrayer, but as a casualty of the same war she's been fighting. A sudden, violent crack shatters the silence. A high-pressure flange on a nearby steam line, neglected for too long, finally gives way. A wall of white, scalding vapor erupts from the pipe, a roaring ghost that fills the aisle in seconds. Linda is blinded, the world turning into a hot, damp void. She lunges forward, her hands searching through the mist until she finds the rough fabric of Mark's sleeve. He grabs her hand back, his grip bruisingly tight, a drowning man finding a lifeline. They stand huddled together in the center of the cloud, the hiss of the steam drowning out the world, the heat pressing against their skin like a physical weight. As the steam begins to dissipate into the high rafters, Linda pulls him toward the exit. She guides him down the treacherous, ice-slicked steps of the service stairs, her hand firm on his arm. Above them, the final siren of the Gary Works begins to wail, a long, mournful cry that signals the death of the fires. It vibrates in her chest, a funeral dirge for the only life she's ever known. They reach the bottom of the stairs, the darkness of the lower levels swallowing them. In the center of the bay, near a stack of abandoned shipping crates, she sees his duffel bag. She drops to her knees, unzipping it with a sharp, decisive motion. She counts the remaining cash, the crumbs of their life, and looks up at him. Her voice is like the steel she used to supervise, hard, tempered, and unbreakable. "No more secrets, Mark," she says. "Every cent, every debt. We carry it together or we don't carry it at all." Mark nods, a slow, jerky motion of his head. The shame is still there, but the isolation has been breached. She zips the bag shut, the sound a final, definitive click. They make their way toward the main gates, passing through the skeletal remains of the assembly line. The plant is no longer a place of work. It's a site of plunder. Groups of men, their faces masked by shadows and desperation, are ripping copper cabling from the walls with crowbars. The sound of tearing metal and breaking glass echoes through the hollow space. A man runs past them carrying a heavy spool of wire, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal greed. Linda doesn't look at them. She keeps her eyes forward, her hand locked in Mark's, walking through the wreckage of their world without looking back. At the gate, she stops. She reaches into her pocket and pulls out the termination notice. She looks at her name, printed in cold, black ink, and then she begins to tear. She rips the paper into halves, then quarters, then tiny, jagged flakes. She opens her hand and lets them fall into a stagnant, oily puddle near the curb. Mark watches as the last of her identity as a steelworker dissolves in the grime. He opens the door of the pickup for her, the hinge screaming in the quiet night. She climbs in, the familiar scent of the cab, tobacco, old wool, and the faint, lingering smell of the mill, wrapping around her. She watches him in the mirror as he walks around to the driver's side. He looks older, smaller. But when he gets in and closes the door, the small space of the cabin feels like the only safe place left in the world. As they pull away, climbing the small rise that leads to the highway, Linda looks back one last time. The lights of the Gary Works are flickering out, one by one, as the skeleton crew cuts the breakers. The massive silhouette of the mill, once the beating heart of the horizon, is being swallowed by the Indiana night. There are no more sparks, no more orange glow against the clouds. Just the dark. She leans her head back against the seat, feeling the rough texture of his jacket against her shoulder. Mark turns the key, and the engine rumbles to life. A steady, rhythmic sound that cuts through the silence. He reaches over and places his hand on her knee, his palm warm and calloused. Linda closes her eyes, breathing in the smell of the rain and the heater's dust. And for the first time in years, she doesn't try to control the road ahead. She simply lets the truck carry them into the dark, together.